Dear students, welcome to week 8. As you remember, last week we ended up with a discussion of different types of powers and how mediators need to know which one is at play in a certain dispute and how to allow for procedural changes to reduce power imbalances and make mediation transformative. So we centered a lot of our discussion on power. So this week we're going to continue to talk about power, right? We'll continue talking about power, but a specific type of power. We're going to talk about coercive power in peacekeeping and reconstruction operations. We're talking about military operations. We are going to see how military forces operating in a war theater use and leverage power to negotiate and mediate with locals during peace-building operations, such as those aiming at the security and reconstruction of the country of operation. The question, therefore, we ask ourselves this week is, do cultural differences play a role in situations where one of the parties can use physical force to impose its will? Or, in another way, to what extent does the negotiator with a gun need to mind about cultural differences to reach a fair agreement? Before we dive into the analysis, it is important to clarify the distinction between two forms of military intervention where armed forces are not only engaged in security operations, but are also expected to negotiate and mediate disputes, often under the constraints on the use of coercive power. This distinction matters because the role of culture in shaping their effectiveness, the effectiveness of these military operations, non-kinetic operations, differs significantly depending on how violence is regulated within each type of mission. For instance, instability, security, transition, and reconstruction operations, SSTR, and we make the example is the US Army in Afghanistan or in Iraq, as forces shift from combat-heavy missions to tasks focused on rebuilding and stabilization, their ability to rely on coercive power, you will see, it will decline. In its place, cultural understanding and local engagement become more essential. Success in these environments increasingly will hinge on the capacity to build trust, to foster cooperation, and support the restoration of governance by integrating in the process and in a meaningful way all those social and political elements in the local society there in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conversely, in UN peacekeeping operations, peacekeepers often enter an environment where violence and political tensions persist. As you see from the slide, the big difference between SSTR and UN peacekeeping is that SSTR is a military invasion where you subdue the opponent and then you start rebuilding that country from that moment on, and you can blend the use of force with negotiating and mediating activities depending on how close and how far you are from using violence, right? And that's why we distinguish military combat operation from negotiation operations. In the case of the United Nations, peacekeeping operations are based on consent of two warring parties to allow a third force, independent force, the United Nations peacekeepers or blue berets, because they wear these blue berets, to interpose themselves between the two warring factions, in order to secure a ceasefire, for example, to implement a ceasefire or an initial slowdown of military operations. So peacekeepers can use force only to defend themselves, but not to impose their mandate. Therefore, they will rely much more than SSTR soldiers on mediation and negotiation tools, because they can't really use much force like the other one. Okay. In this class, however, we will focus more on SSTR operations. However, there are class materials you have seen that concern more UN peacekeeping operations. At the end, though, I will still try to draw some conclusions about both type of operations, and you will see I will kind of repeat what I just said before. Anyway, as we said before, we will use SSTR operation as an example to determine whether coercive power can be freely used also in reconstruction and non-kinetic, non-combat operations, or whether better results can be achieved if the soldiers, instead of always threatening force to achieve an agreement, are trained to deal with the locals and with their cultural differences using more traditional negotiating and mediating powers. To do this, to conduct this analysis, we will look at how soldiers negotiate with locals in an array of situations that are not directly connected with the need to use force. Like, for example, as I said before, business and supply negotiations, reconstruction negotiation, administrative negotiations, mediation of logistic and administrative disputes, etc., between the occupying army and the local chiefs, the local sheikhs, in particular if you were in Afghanistan or Iraq. If you were in Bosnia, you could have said, a warlord, they use the warlord, etc., etc. So this is what the army tells, their soldiers. You have to be fanatical in understanding your area of operation. It's what you're going to do for the next year of your life. You wouldn't buy a house without knowing every nook and cranny of the same and getting it inspected. So why wouldn't you move into the negotiation with the same intensity? This is what, you can hear a surgeon major, telling this to the new guys that just landed at the camp in Fallujah, right, in Iraq. So how can the context of the situation affect negotiation when it relates to power, coercive power, and to culture? Can cultural differences affect power dynamics? Well, USGIs are generally trained to consider a number of factors when engaging with local authorities, right? With local communities or even individuals. And as we said, the first rule is determine the context. Where and when is the negotiation taking place? Is it a negotiation with a local armed group holding hostages, or stopping someone, a suspect vehicle at a checkpoint? Or is it rather a negotiation sitting down in a tent with some tea and local sweets, talking with a local administrator about the running of a new hospital or a school? Obviously, in the first case, or the one of the hostage situation or the checkpoint stops, we are talking about negotiations and discussion where use of force is likely or imminent. This is what we would call kinetic operation. We can make another example, like, for example, when a company arrives in a certain village and is armed up to the teeth to collect information about the whereabouts or rebels, right? So that's obviously, these are situations where we are very close to use of force, and the use of force is put into account, right? If I don't get the information for the local chief about the hiding rebel, I'm gonna put the gun in front of his face. I will probably do, and I will probably call reinforcement if they try to oppose the initial show of force, right? So in this situation, how does negotiation work? Would I care about cultural differences? Yeah, the fact that the sheikh there is a Muslim and I'm a Christian, for example, right? I'm a soldier, Caucasian, white American, Christian lieutenant facing this sheikh, Muslim sheikh. So what would that religion respect local practices be so relevant in that situation? Yes or no, right? This is the question. On the other hand, in the second type of cases, when I sit with the chieftain in front of a tea set with some sweets and pastry from the local village to discuss how to run the new open hospital, who's gets access to the hospital, who's not, stuff like that. Obviously, I'm not in a situation where I directly confront the risk of armed intervention, right? It is evident that depending on that, it depends also whether the soldier needs to concern himself with cross-cultural differences and how to negotiate with the local. So if I don't have the impelling need or fear of use of violence, obviously there's more space for culture, and therefore culture can affect power dynamics, right? Now, it becomes clear that as military operations move further away from kinetic combat-driven context, the reliance on coercive power decreases as well. In these non-kinetic environments, the overt or exaggerated threat of force can actually be counterproductive, often resulting in fragile or short-lived agreements. Again, get the example of negotiating, calmly about an administrative topic with friendly locals, with drinking tea together. You couldn't imagine that I put my hand on the holster or I take the gun from my holster and put it on the table. The first moment the counterpart disagree on who has access to that new facility, for example, right? That would be probably unnecessary and would be definitely souring the other side, right? Instead, to achieve a sustainable outcome, I rather have myself employing good negotiating skills, right? And understanding the culture of the other side. That's why determining context is very important. Therefore, culture becomes important depending on that context. All this underscores the need for training programs that prioritize contextual awareness. US military manuals already highlight the importance of assessing the local environment. They would do it also for other purposes of a military operation, not only for this specific negotiating purposes, right? And what you have to do in those cases, right? You need to ask, who are the real stakeholders, right? Who are you actually dealing with? And what are the consequences of engaging the wrong sheikh or community leaders? How can you interpret or respond to cultural cues to avoid misunderstanding or making false promises? This is all very important. So, again, in the simple example I said before, you're sitting in front of this amazing tea set in this very charming tent. I may have to think about all these things, like a normal negotiator would do, or a normal mediator would do in those situations. This week readings provided ample examples of cultural unpreparedness of those soldiers, especially in those operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many soldiers reported feeling ill-equipped to operate in unfamiliar cultural landscapes. They often entered negotiation knowing only that they carried a weapon and had authorization to use it if necessary, but lacked the cultural literacy to interpret those social dynamics and engage effectively with locals. There was one example, the example of the rental fee, where the US personnel were unfamiliar with the local currency and found themselves at a significant disadvantage And this situation illustrates a clear case of information asymmetry. You know from past lessons what information asymmetry is, right? One party doesn't know enough and therefore cannot make informed decision. Maybe it will get the wrong perceptions, it will start triggering a lot of biases, etc., etc. So we have a clear case of information asymmetry here because it doesn't know the currency, local currency. So how can he determine the value of the transaction, of the rental fee? Of course, this not only led in that case to confusion and frustration, but also jeopardized the success of the negotiation. To avoid such pitfalls, soldiers must be trained to develop cultural awareness and adopt a mindset of preparation and inquiry. This includes conducting background search, when possible, about the culture, the local culture. And also, it requires that you know how to frame questions, how to ask questions. Remember the famous Socratic method of questioning the other party, right? And it has to be done in a culturally appropriate manner, not offensive. You are in front, likely, to a type of high context communicator in front of you with high power distance, with very strong religious values. Well, you need to account for all these factors. Otherwise, you jeopardize your job. It was the example, very nice example, of the officer negotiating with a resistant local authority over expanding the hospital services, right? This illustrates, in my opinion, how cultural awareness and addressing information asymmetry can lead to mutually beneficial, the so-called win-win outcomes, right? While also allowing the local leaders, for example, to save face towards their stakeholders. Yeah. In that case, you remember the hospital management had been misusing the resources to restrict access to medical services, limiting them to the local elite, right? So they had as stakeholders, they had this elite on the back. On the other hand, they had the local population not having a full access to those hospital services because they had excuses that they don't have the resources. In reality, they were misusing the resources, okay? However, the officer uncovered this manipulation and uncovered this information about the misuse, and therefore he was able to leverage it strategically, at the same time in a way that didn't make the negotiators on the other side lose face, right? So that was a very good example. Yeah. So he also, interestingly, he identified shared values. For example, both parties ultimately agreed that a broader access to healthcare for the general population of that local area was necessary. So by aligning with this common goal, adopting the appropriate tone, posture, cultural sensitive approach, this officer was indeed perceived as very professional, very respectful, and therefore a person agreeable, and people would have kept negotiating in the future in a fruitful manner. And he would have avoided also the risk of being manipulated, which is big. Imagine in a context where you don't speak the language, you're relying on translators, and you don't know much of the culture. You need to prepare yourself to kind of level all the playing field, try to smooth all these disadvantages. Okay. Now, let's try to use all what we have said until now to get closer to the answer to our initial questions, right? Does culture matter when you as a negotiator can use force anytime because you get into a meeting with a gun? Now, let's read this slide. A civil military relations officer assessing the general prerequisite of trust in Iraqi culture acknowledged that there's not a lot of trust between men in a place like Iraq. However, the appearance of trust, or the social obligation to demonstrate trust, is almost as powerful as the trust itself. What does this quote mean? What does it tell us? In this quote, it summarizes a little bit what we have said until now. To me, the quote means that cultural context is very important, also when you could get deals by just threatening the use of force. The example is clear. In a high context culture, like the one where this soldier is operating, and he's a low context, yeah, it's American, low context, right? So in a high context culture where formality, high power distance play a key role, and religion as a value, obliging people to behave in a degree, to give trust, at least on the surface, right? Trust itself, at least, is formally acknowledged, even if it's not deeply sincere, right? We'll discuss in a few classes about apology. We have in the same situation for apology, sincere apology and apology, no matter whether it's sincere or not. Here is the same situation. For certain cultures, an apology is an apology, whether it's sincere or not. Same here. Trust is even if you don't feel it, you have to give it because of social and religious rules. What does that mean again? Context. It means that also trust is defined in different ways by different cultures. But to me, what it means, it helps us understanding. It means that context is important, and once you are in these situations, cultural awareness of the other culture and your own becomes key. So we go back to week 1, self-awareness and awareness of others' culture. So how can this now help us finally answer our initial question about the role of culture and power in this peculiar negotiating context? I apologize. I have to, prefer to put you all the text here. So for me, it's easier to have it in front of me. So 3 factors can help us determine if culturally shared knowledge would likely make a difference in negotiation due to cross-cultural variations in the SSTR context. The first one is that culture affects context. We said before. Not sharing the same values and understanding of issues can compromise the outcome of the negotiation. We know from all the past lessons that in any cross-cultural negotiations, including the one we're discussing today, there can be at least 3 main factors played: biases, communication and language differences, and power distance. The second one is the type of situation the soldiers is dealing with. How close is this task to kinetic operations? Is it simply a business negotiation? Is it a conflict among tribes? So the last factor is the negotiator's state of mind, and more importantly, his training and skills. If we can analyze the role played by each of them in a given situation, we can find out the role culture play and whether coercive power will be used in a negotiation to replace deal-making, using instead peaceful negotiating skills. All the above can maybe help us finally answer the following question in relation, in particular, to this statement. The greater the asymmetry of power between the parties or perception, the greater the chance that the cultural differences between them will play less of a role in affecting how the parties negotiate. Why would that be true? Well, power asymmetry is a fact in such type of operations, right? However, we have seen that context also reduces the need or even the appropriateness of the use of force, especially when soldiers are dealing with situations that are far from kinetic operations. This does not mean that soldiers might not indirectly point out to this power asymmetry to push reluctant local negotiators. See, for example, the threat of coming back with a whole battalion, if the local sheikh does not provide the required passage to the convoy or stuff like that, right? So, in conclusion, we can start, getting closer to our, final answer. However, the more we distance ourselves from situations where force may be a threat, then the use of power is less needed and recommended, and culture will play, therefore, a more important role in reaching a good and durable agreement. So things like BATNA will take center stage again. It'll replace other forms of power struggle. Power dynamics will start shifting based on negotiation tactics and cultural competencies rather than by the threat of use of force. I think that this is a fair and understandable conclusion. To wrap up the discussion, it's important to highlight how fundamentally different the context is. This affects also the influence of culture and the difference of the culture plays in a negotiation. Okay, so closer to the use of force, less relevance or no relevance. The more far we are from the need to use of force, culture and cultural competency will become more and more important. As I said at the beginning, this is very different from the context in which UN peacekeeping operations are working, because as I said, this is about SSTR missions. However, UN peacekeeping operations are more typically authorized to use force only in self-defense, as we said before. Even when they are deployed in kinetic environments, such as interposing themselves between warring factions, their ability to use force is limited to self-defense, and therefore they will always have to rely on negotiation and mediation. And therefore I would say, where in SSTR, culture plays a lesser role compared to UN peacekeeping operation overall. Okay. Now, to conclude, the last three slides, I'm sorry. We're going to look a little bit again at context. So, perceptions, and in particular, in this case, for number one, the role of perception. Perception is very important because, and is related to context, right? So, can coercive power automatically transform into a strong BATNA for a military, and during a military negotiation? Well, the answer depends really on perception. Again, a skillful negotiator can significantly enhance their power through effective communication, shaping how their intentions and capability are understood by the other party. Even when the actual BATNA is weak, the perceived ability to apply force, or simply the potential for coercion, can still influence the other side's behavior and decisions. This is especially relevant in SSTR operations, where the military is generally seen as having the legitimacy to use force. However, in non-kinetic phases of such missions, that perception becomes less central, and other factors like building relationships, establishing trust, and aligning common interests become more important in achieving negotiation success. And there's another thing that we need to consider. There are different types of powers, as you can see in this slide. So we have focused today on coercive power. However, based on context, based on perceptions, and based on the competence and skill and ability and awareness and everything that we have discussed before, a soldier may choose different types of powers that still can be used and also obviously backed up by the coercive power, but they don't have to show coercive power. They can show the other type of powers, implying that they're backed up by the coercive power. So there are remuneration, identification, and normative conformity. These are other examples. So in SSTR operations, we have seen, and we conclude here, that yes, culture can still play a role, and cultural differences can still play a role in certain situations. However, the use of power remains there. The ability of soldiers to threaten the use of power remain there, and obviously there is possibility that you may combine power moves with integrative negotiation, like an example of the you read in the reading of this week of the Marine in Fallujah. The important is that avoid reciprocation of power-based communication. So if they talk loud, and big, you may want to de-escalate first. And again, listen and ask questions, the Socratic method, as I mentioned before. So, and this is all for this week. Thank you for your attention.